Welcome to Project Chatter, the podcast where PPM experts from various sectors talk about the latest trends. Listen to Val and Dale as they talk about tried and tested best practices and share their unfiltered thoughts about the industry. Whether you're here to learn how to progress your career, improve your project control skills, or just want to hear an Aussie and South African rant about projects, then you've come to the right place. Welcome to the Project Chatter podcast with your hosts, Dale Fung and Val Matthews.
In this episode, we spoke to Dr. Atif Ansar. Dr. Atif is the founding director of the Oxford's Program on Sustainable Megaprojects. He is a senior fellow of the MSc in Major Program Management and the Major Projects Leadership Academy, MPLA, for the UK and Australian government at the Sayed Business School, University of Oxford.
He is also the co-founder of Foresight, the leading predictive project delivery platform that empowers leaders of the world's most critical projects to transform construction schedules into strategic decision-making tools using AI. This was a fascinating conversation, Val. We haven't actually dove too deeply into data centers, and it was great that Atif brought this topic to the table because it allowed us to explore with him. You and I, haven't had lots of experience with data centers, so it allowed us to really delve into what makes a data center tick and why it is unique. What stood out for you?
Well, just the breadth of his knowledge, not just academically, the build and what's happening economically for data centers, the scaling. We went kind of all over the place. Lon got a mention. We talked about sci-fi. We kind of went left of field as you would expect from Project Chatter, but obviously a really jam-packed and informative episode. How about yourself?
Yeah, no, absolutely. We'd love to have Atif back. I think he'd love to come back. He said to us he had a lot of fun. Hopefully he wasn't just teasing us. But we won't spoil it too much for you folks. Get stuck in. I'm sure you'll love this episode. So we'll leave it there. As we say, keep listening, keep liking, and keep paying it forward.
Hello, project people. Guess what? Welcome back to a brand new episode of your favorite Project Chatter podcast. It's good to have you with us. Dale, good to see you, sir. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks, Phil. Nice to see you as well. It's good this side of the pond. We're heating up. The days are getting longer. I'm looking forward to the clocks changing. Are you getting colder that side of the world?
Well, I don't know if you noticed the hoodie, but it's starting to get a bit cold down here in the south. So I'm sad because I had a very quick summer, it felt like. I did get to see the Formula One, though, last weekend, which I haven't seen in a couple of years, so that's fantastic. Well, look, let's bring our guest in. We've got a new guest for our listeners today, Atif Ansar. How are you, sir?
Doing very well, thank you. Good to be here.
Mate, good to have you, and thanks for taking time out. I know you're flying all over and doing things. Because this is your first pod, we'd love to kick it off with a soft start. What's your origin story, mate? How did you get into the projects and data centers, etc.?
So look, great to be here with you guys, and greetings from New York. It's very warm. It's 21 Celsius today, which is super nice, having been almost minus 21 degrees just a few weeks ago. So look, I am an entrepreneur. I wear two hats. I am a co-founder of Foresight, and we're an AI to speed up the construction of big projects like data centers. Prior to launching Foresight, I've been an academic at Oxford University since 2006. I did my PhD, my DPhil there, as we call it in Oxford. And through the course of my work with my colleagues, I ended up building one of the world's largest data sets of its kind, tracking outcomes of big projects. So what people hope to achieve in terms of cost and time when they set out and what they actually get on the other side. That data set then allowed me and my team to build a variety of machine learning algorithms to really predict and prevent delays, and we focus on time. We now serve quite a large chunk of the data center industry, and I'm very excited to talk to you about it today.
Yeah, that's awesome, Atif, and it's great to have you on. And you know, it's oftentimes when we cross the divide between academia and practice where we find the sweet spot. Not everything happens in theory, but there's a lot that can be learned on site as well. So really interested to get your perspectives on this. And so you've brought data centers as a topic, and we said we could explore this in all different ways. But you spoke there of sort of, as we like to call it in project controls, you know, that golden triangle of cost, time, quality, etc. And that never really goes away. And we know that technology is there to help with it. But I guess if we talk specifically on data centers, Are they different to any other types of construction? Are they unique in any which way?
Very, very good question, Dale. I think one thing to know about data centers is that the total construction volume is just exploding out of proportion. 5 years ago in 2020, there were about 500 megawatts worth of data centers under construction. Data centers are sort of measured in megawatts, a bit like power plants based on the total power consumption. Now that metric is closer to 20x. It's hard to be precise about it because there's as many bragawatts being built as there are megawatts. So there's a lot of announcements of new project starts that are actually never built, and there's lots of market reasons for why people are doing that. But it's an absolutely spellbound growth in a sector. They are intriguing assets because they are very complex, but for some reason, myth has settled in the minds of a lot of people that data centers are simple assets. Back in the day, they weren't so complex. And so almost a lot of real estate professionals went into it, and people began treating them like warehouses with a lot of cables in them. But as time's gone by, they've become so complex, they're closer to an oil refinery or a large industrial manufacturing or pharmaceutical type of assets in terms of the total MEP footprint involved in it. And the mindset hasn't necessarily caught up. So it causes people more surprise around delivery of these projects than would even be the norm in other projects, because they expect to build a warehouse and they end up with an oil refinery and they're like, what the hell's going on? I thought I was building this easy project, and it's actually a very, very hard project. So I think along with that growth is actually quite a deep challenge in getting these assets built. And I think a third thing that goes with it is that the supply chain and the labor volume available to build this asset is very small. So, data centers account for give or take 10% of construction volume globally right now, but they only account for 0.05% of the labor force. So the total gap between people available, skills available, and what they're trying to achieve is vast. And hence my interest in bringing AI to this field, because more than any other asset type, it needs this AI amplification.
Yeah, that's interesting, Atif. And it's probably for our listeners as well. We vary with projects, but it's probably, we don't talk about data centers enough, but they are definitely a bit of a buzz. I like the bragger watts what you talked about before, Atif. I think that's true. But for the layman's out there, just the basic understanding of what are the key components or assets that make up a data center, just for the guys listening on the...
It's a great question. So I think two things apply. One is the classic canonical iron triangle of physical scope, cost, and time. The physical scope, of course, we can make this more interesting and add things like quality and benefits and environment and stakeholders, etc. But just sticking to the original formulation of the model from 1970s, in terms of physical scope, we're talking megawatts, like I mentioned. So 100 megawatts would, require about 250,000 square feet worth of warehousing space, give or take. In terms of budget, each megawatt costs about $10 to $15 million per megawatt, based on the type of systems you're putting in. In terms of timelines, people hope to achieve them in 16 months. They're lucky if they get 24 months, sometimes 36 months. So, quite a lot of delay. In terms of physical components of the physical scope itself, obviously you've got land, you need power. That's a critical constraint. You do need a big shed of some sort, and you need a lot of kit, a lot of cables. You need cooling systems. They were air cooled, but very large pieces of equipment, chillers, liquid cooling equipment, and then racks, and ultimately chips, which is what goes in. So those are sort of the rough components. You can also think of it as site power, gray space, which includes all your mechanical and electrical equipment, and then the white space, which is where all your chips go, which is really the jewel in the crown jewel inside the asset, basically. The cost of the chips, by the way, is staggering. So a 100 megawatt data center probably costs about $1 billion to build from a kit perspective, so the space itself, the compute, the chips cost probably 3x that. So a 100 megawatt data center, which is kind of commodity these days, is a $4 billion asset. So it's a mega of mega projects in my world. From an academic perspective, we consider anything over $1 billion as a mega project. So these data centers popping up are as mega as they get.
Yeah, they're pretty mind-boggling when you think about it, because all we see really in the news is, as you say, the announcements, but then Nvidia's going up. Oh, okay, should I buy or not? And what does it actually mean? You kind of bring that to life for the project professionals that listen to this podcast. And I usually reserve this area, this topic, this person for Val, because he loves to bring him up in all of our various episodes. But Mr. Musk, Elon Musk, he's got this idea of putting data centers in space. And orbiting the Earth. And to many, that's like, wow, that's crazy. But, it's not actually that far-fetched. What are your comments, thoughts, ideas around that?
Look, I don't fully understand the physics of how you put data centers in space, but we will need them in due course of time, right? So just simply to power space launches. Getting to the moon is really, really important. If we're ever going to become a multi-planet society, having moon-based space launch is absolutely critical, because Earth's gravity is a killer, and it's a miracle that we can get anything even outside the Earth's orbit. So getting to the moon is going to be critical. And from that perspective, space has essentially unlimited power if you power the solar panels as well as cooling. But I think the physics is a little bit more complicated because of radiation, etc., which is not my domain. So I'm not going to pontificate on stuff that I don't understand too well. But I think it's in principle a very interesting idea, and more power to Mr. Musk and his team to put data centers in space. I'll be watching this space myself.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting concept in terms of what we can do with space. I think the one thing I was just discussing this with a few other colleagues, and one of the areas or challenges that came out of the discussion was potentially, although space is cool itself, how would you disperse the heat, right? Because you need something to conduct the heat away from whatever you're doing. It just doesn't naturally just go into space because it's a bit of a vacuum. But anyway, I'm not a scientist. I don't know. Val, any thoughts on this topic? I know you love Elon.
Well, I like what he's doing, and I agree with you, Atif. Like, we need to get outside of the planetary orbit just to get our base started if we want to go anywhere. But there are challenges with doing this anywhere, and particularly the vacuum of space. I wouldn't comment on what Elon's doing because, again, I don't think anyone's really on that thinking headspace. But even data centers on the ground, I think, present a big, massive challenge. There's space, obviously. I was reading the UK's data center market, so there's 500 active facilities in London, which is the largest in Europe. And we've got a bit of a different challenge in Australia. Australia's investing massively in data centers, Atif, as well, but we don't have nuclear power. So if you talk about the supply chain before, Atif, and having energy, do we have enough energy to power the demand for data centers that we're currently talking about? The expansions across, I think every country is trying to do the same thing. Middle East is trying to do the same thing. Down here in Australia and Asia Pacific is trying to do the same thing. What do we expect from an energy supply chain? Because obviously if we don't have energy, we can't have compute. How do we solve the energy problem with that? Have you had a thought about that or talked about that?
Absolutely. So I think going back to Musk for a quick second, I've written about SpaceX before and how they've managed to bring down the cost curve of sending a payload up in space by nearly 10x. And I did a comparative study of how much cost overruns and time overruns do NASA projects have versus SpaceX projects. So I think one thing is quite clear, that SpaceX and what they've achieved is utterly phenomenal. And I think in that sense, the engineering, I have a lot of confidence in his team to be able to do things like that. Again, I can't pontificate like yourself, Dale, on the science aspects of it and the feasibility, but they do have they have done miraculous things before, and I'm sure they'll continue to do that. On the energy equation, Val, that is the key constraint for data centers. So basically, data centers, the top constraints are energy, obviously land and land availability and community agreement. But then after that, power, water, fiber are sort of critical constraints, and energy being the overriding constraint. My sense on this, and I'm thinking more like an economist more than anything else, and just big picture, is that demand induces its own supply. So if we were to take a completely static snapshot of the energy grid today, particularly in a country like Australia, which is sort of fairly long, thin strip of a grid, no, there isn't enough energy at this snapshot of time to supply all the megawatts or the bragawatts that have been announced. But markets are dynamic. Demand induces supply. And my view is that data centers, because they are concentrated, sophisticated players, and generally very thorough players, because they are serving onward customers that are very sophisticated. So they are almost compelled to comply to very, very high standards of security, environment. Just the overall approach is probably more professional than, say, putting up a block of residential flats. And the expectation is, in many cases, these are defense customers, so on and so forth. They are having to build their own power in case of self-supply. There's abundant gas in the world. They're also playing with renewable energy. So I think nuclear is like something that's going to happen over 10, 15 years. But well before then, there's, quite a lot of new supply that's coming online. I would dare say about a third of the power is self-supply at this point, where it's not even pulling from the grid. And I think that is inducing huge innovation in new microgrids, in new just self-supply grids. I think energy market will keep pace. And if anything, it may help stodgy utilities and stodgy TSOs to up their game and just become more competitive to serve very sophisticated, very technologically savvy set of new customers that just don't take always, that basically are going to push them to innovate.
Yeah, that's great. I think as well, the other challenge that I was thinking about while you were talking is the technology redundancy, where technology is advancing at a certain pace. How do you, and obviously even in 36 months, we've seen so much advancement in AI alone, in compute power, in GPUs, in how they're built, which is phenomenal, by the way. If anyone's not seen how these GPUs are built, there's some really excellent videos on YouTube. It's amazing. As you said, it's a miracle how they build these things. I mean, it's so precise, down to the T. But how do we then, if you're building data centers, keep up with the advancement of technology? Are these data centers being built with technology that'll be redundant in a couple of years and they get retrofitted? What's the lifespan of an asset like a data center?
You're asking great questions. By the way, because your listeners are project professionals, one thing I can certainly suggest to all of them is that if you don't work in the data center industry and adjacent sectors like energy, please consider careers in this industry. It's very lucrative. The work is extremely exciting, and you're on the cutting edge of technology. For those of them, people considering these careers, is super, super exciting. Look, the data center equation is a very complex one. The assets are very long term. They're basically built to withstand a nuclear bomb. They just have to be that secure. So in theory, the concrete structure, the steel and concrete, could last 100 years. And all the auxiliary infrastructure, the underground utilities, the containment, everything, like these are some of the most secure, some of the most sophisticated piece of construction ever built. So imagine, I'm exaggerating, but imagine a 100-year envelope. Then the contractual commercial lease terms between, say, a hyperscaler like a Microsoft or Amazon Web Services and a developer like in Australia, CDC or NextDC or AirTrunk is 15 years. So they will, an AirTrunk would sign a 15-year lease with a hyperscaler. And in that period, the developer gets a monthly payment for availability. So they just have to make, 100 megawatts worth of power available that a hyperscaler could put chips in. So 100-year asset, 15-year commercial lease, the chips are obsolete every 2 years.
Wow.
And the power infrastructure and the cooling infrastructure is changing very rapidly. So things that were air-cooled 6 months ago have to be liquid-cooled tomorrow. The type of chip is changing. So that warehouse that could last for 100 years could be housing your classic CPU, which is your typical storage chips for storing your Netflix films. It could have GPUs to process AI training workloads. It could have LPUs to process inference of LLMs, and it could, in very short order, have QPUs to process quantum workloads and do quantum computing. all under the same roof. So I think it's sort of forcing a design change and a very new way of thinking for developers of how to build with these very distinct temporal horizons and see how they swap around them. And I think it's creating a lot of market opportunity because some people will get this equation wrong and they will end up building assets that become obsolete, and other people will get it right and they're going to make a lot of money. And I think it's an exciting area to become a developer in the data center world. And as a result, you see big amounts, big bets. Nscale just raised $2 billion, very different model than an air trunk. Largest Series C in Europe, valuing them over $14 billion. So space to watch and big strategic bets to make, and some will go really horribly wrong, and others will make people, there'll be multiple billionaires minted out of this in years to come.
Wow, you certainly make it sound very compelling, and you're right. There is a huge demand across all the various sectors for project professionals, and the data center market is exciting as well. We know, me being based in the UK, Atif, that the UK struggles, actually, if you think about it, to compete on the global stage with data centers, primarily because of how expensive power is in the UK. But then there's space constraints as well. Grid connections, I know, is another challenge. But then you just look across the channel and you look at, Austria and the Nordic regions and how they're looking at the space they've got there and the power supply they have there and the fewer challenges they have there for data centers to be built. But I wanted to sort of ask you a related technology and how this might impact potentially compute, because you mentioned things like, the chips and how advanced they're getting and all the way through into quantum. One of the areas that I've started exploring myself as well is edge computing, and how you might take away the need to compute something in the cloud or remotely. And what pros and cons there might be. Now, again, I'm not an expert in this space, but I'm quite intrigued as technology advances and we can start doing on-device compute more, what that means potentially for data centers. My own thinking, for me certainly, I don't think that impacts it too drastically, but it potentially multiplies what you can then do with a combination of edge computing as well as data centers in combination. What are your thoughts around that?
Look, I'm going to give you a very nerdy response, a very academic response. So there's a whole branch of mathematics known as fractals. And it's an area invented by a guy called Benoit Mandelbrot, who worked at the Bell Labs back in the 60s. The Bell Labs or IBM. I'm blanking on the exact location. But anyway, the idea is that there's very self-similar structures in the universe. So, a branch of a tree is, self-similar to the tree itself, which is self-similar to the whole forest, in a way. And Mandelbrot wrote, papers like How Long is the Coast of Britain, and the basic idea is a grain of sand is self-similar to a pebble, which is self-similar to a rock, which is self-similar to a cliff. So that basically means it depends on the measuring rod. So if you were to measure across every grain of sand across the coast of Britain, it would be an infinite coastline. But if you just measured the cliffs, it would be a much shorter coastline. So these things are very, very interesting. Computers are also fractal. So you could think of my Apple Watch that I'm wearing to my iPhone, to my Mac that I'm talking to. I'm not trying to sell my Apple ecosystem, but that's where I'm plugged into, to the data center, the edge data center in New York, to the much bigger data center, and any AI that's going to work on this. These are all kind of similar idea. They're self-similar to each other. So I think in these self-similar structures, like think of it like a broccoli structure, or a cauliflower structure. You basically have all forms of compute all at the same time. So you have micro edge that's happening in your Apple Watch, and then you have gigawatt campuses all operating all at the same time in order for this whole network to work. So in that sense, this is not competition. There's going to be coarse grain elements of this fractal, like the big cliffs that I was talking about, and there will be the fine grain elements of this fractal, which is the grains of sand I was talking about, and they all kind of work as one amalgamation, and they're not competitive to each other. They're the one and the same thing. It's the coastline of Britain, if that makes sense by analogy.
Yeah, it's very interesting. This is a very interesting topic for us, Atif, because we're not that close to the data center side of things, and I'm sure for listeners this is very insightful. Obviously, AI is touching everything we do these days in technology and work and how we work. It's progressing at such a rate. I mean, I don't go into a conversation with clients anymore without AI being brought up at least 10 times. There is this buzz and this hyperbole, I get that. But there's also real practical applications and use cases now emerging in every industry, every sector. And the promise is huge, right? I was wondering how AI might change the way data centers are designed and built. Is that being considered as well, that maybe AI, I did see something the other day, Dale, around the first AI, first engine being designed without an engineer, completely built by AI, and it worked first time. So there's very exciting prospects around what AI can do in the design space. Is it being utilized now for building its own data centers?
Great question, Val. So, look, Foresight, my company, for full disclaimer, is an AI company. So, of course, I believe in the prospect of AI, being critical to building data centers as well as other assets. So, let's go back to the iron triangle of scope, cost, and time. One of my core insights was that people over obsess with cost in the project industry. So, every single company has a finance director. Every single project has a finance director. I've met hundreds of CFOs in my, all over the world. I've never met a chief time officer. No project has a chief time officer. And it turns out that time is actually the more finite currency. You can print money, you can't make time. In industries like data centers, where time to market is super critical because it's a hyper competitive race right now. And there's a lot of revenues, not just like the prospect of artificial general intelligence people are chasing. There's a lot of money on the stake. And every week's revenue is millions of dollars. That time to market becomes really, really important. So that's why, we ended up majoring in time to market, particularly for data centers. So I think some of the problems that AI solves, and by AI here, I mean a very broad litany of tools. People get very emotional about AI as a subject, and I don't think in the common discourse there's an agreed upon definition of AI, and sometimes very basic automation in our common parlance also stands for AI in my world. So I'm taking a very broad view of what is AI rather than, a very specific or a very a narrow view that some people like to prefer to take. So I think if you were to take sort of, any number of use cases from, for example, generating schedules from your design, doing an offtake from the design, and then resource loading your schedule, converting that resource loaded schedule into a budget, then providing on-site verification and using computer vision to then update your schedule autonomously. All of these are domains for multiple forms of AIs to produce value and interact with each other and speed up the process. All of this eventually will lead to robotic assembly of data centers, and that operating system, in fullness of time, will inevitably be an intelligent system that uses multiple sensory inputs, from vision to scanning the environment, scanning documents, etc., to then build these assets with greater and greater autonomous control. Essentially, a bit like what's happened with shipping, containerized shipping. So 50 years ago, thousands of people were involved in loading and unloading a ship. Now it's largely a robotic process with a few highly skilled operators operating cranes to move staggering loads through a highly modularized design. And it's sort of where construction of technical assets like data centers is going, in my view, as well.
Yeah, and I think that hits on some of the questions we get, Dale, from project controls and the planning space. Being project professionals ourselves, Latif, we get a lot of questions about what we should be studying, what kind of skills should we be focusing on. And whilst, yes, you can broadly in terms, you can speak about AI and ChatGPT and all this stuff, But if you wanted to get into the data center space, what skills would you recommend people should be learning? I guess there's something for everybody on data center builds from the sound of it, being a mega project. But what would you recommend if someone was asking you, a friend, a colleague?
So look, if it was me or like my, nephews were asking me this question, first to start with the analog world. So before you jump to AI, become a subject matter expert using pen and paper, in your chosen field. And the simple thing is, like, essentially as an academic, I'm a professional writer. In order to write, if I know the art of writing incredibly well, for me, LLMs become incredibly useful to improve both the quality and speed of that writing. But if I don't know how to write at all, it's very difficult to generate ideas to even begin writing. So AI is not going to solve the problem. So I have to start with a core skill of how to write, which is an analog problem, before I move to the digital amplifier. So my first piece of advice would be become a subject matter expert in something. And know that, be the best in the world in that area, AI or not. And then once you've mastered that field, use AI to get ahead. Like drop any drama you have about AI, and just get into the mindset that here's an extremely valuable tool that I can use to just get like dominantly ahead of any of my competitors. And that basically takes you to the scale of becoming extremely good at generating prompts and becoming very creative around how we use them. One final point I should mention is I'm just about to publish a kind of a thought piece around this idea of who uses AI better. Is it the extreme specialists or is it the generalists? Which I call foxes versus hedgehogs. So foxes being the generalists. And it sort of comes from a poem by a fragment from a Greek philosopher. And the idea is a fox knows many things, whereas the hedgehog only knows one big thing. So despite my recommendation to become a subject matter expert, you also need enough agility and enough cunning to be able to, think through or laterally across multiple fields. And what my research there with colleagues shows is AI is extremely useful for foxes because they've got the open-mindedness to be able to deploy it across multiple domains and integrate multiple systems. So yes, become a subject matter expert, but don't become a bore in the process. Maintain a degree of horizontal breadth and agility, and that AI will help you get ahead very, very quickly.
I love that, Atif. That's a really good way of putting it, because we talk about creativity being a really fine art form, and I come from a family of artists. I'm the only person in my family who's an actual project professional, which was bizarre. But I've found, and I've worked with Dale, and I'll maybe get Dale's view on this, is I find I'm sitting more on the creative side. So writing I consider creative as well. I sit more on that side when I'm thinking or interacting with AI than I do on the pragmatic, structured, controlled space. And I find that the writing that I produce and the prompting that I do, even the vibe coding, whatever else I'm building, is actually more advantageous when I think creatively than when I do think like a project manager or a project expert. Dale, what's your view on this? Because I know we've talked about this on other pods around innovation and design and design thinking and lateral thinking. What's your view on what Atif just said?
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think AI, and if we specific, the ability to be quite precise with what you're trying to do from a task or activity perspective allows the generalist to be far more valuable than the specialist. And you're finding that specialists are more easily replaced by the technology. And I have had an interesting conversation, just quickly in terms of using the tech. I totally agree with you there, Val, because I find my personal learning and growth has exponentially increased since I can just go to a tool and learn about anything I want, right? There's nothing I can't go and learn about. Yes, I've got to fact check it to make sure there's no hallucinations and things like that, but the information is accessible far quicker. Just the point on jobs. I think that in time to come, there won't be any jobs that technology, AI or robotics won't be able to accomplish. I think human jobs will eventually, and we don't know this is my sort of just futurescaping. I think human specific jobs, the demand for those will be based on what humans choose for other humans to do. So, for example, would you rather go to a social setting like a pub and be served a beer by a vending machine? Or do you actually want someone on the other side pouring your pint and passing it across to you and maybe having a bit of a chat, right? Do you want to go to a theater where there's just robots on stage performing a play? Or do you want to actually see humans where there's potential error, right? So the things that make us human, I think, are potentially the jobs. And I know there's sort of predominantly arts in there, but there might be other things as well. So yeah, I think that's where we'll probably head. But again, I may be totally wrong. But just my few cents there. I'll pause there, Atif. I know you want to come in.
So I think the creativity point is super important, right? So I think project professionals are some of the most creative professionals because in order to build a project, you're basically juggling a million balls in the air. And, million balls that you planned and another million that just sort of come from the left field. And it just requires a huge amount of creativity to keep the entire constellation together, without dropping those balls. And it just requires that agility and that flexibility and also cunning at the end of the day to cut through all of that and get there. And I think to your point as well, like the threat of jobs from AI is completely exaggerated. There will be dislocation, but like not unemployment.
Yes.
So give you an example. I grew up in Pakistan. When I was literally a little kid, there were people on a kind of middle of the street in the in like little circus of like 5 roads meeting, and they were direct traffic. There were no signals. Like there was no red, amber, green lights to route the traffic. There was literally a well-dressed officer, even in like heat of Islamabad, like directing traffic with their hands. And of course, over time, as the country electrified, those people went away. It's replaced by an autonomous technology that provides that signaling system. But it's not to say that they went completely unemployed. They went to other jobs. And yes, there's a degree of dislocation for them as they transition from a relatively unpleasant work of standing in that heat and directing traffic to doing something else. Potentially issuing speeding fines or whatever else they got up to. You can't deny that in grand scheme of things, that's a better thing to do. A human being shouldn't be standing in 45 Celsius directing traffic when you've got a perfectly fine and a safer signaling mechanism that can route that traffic. So I think same thing with AI systems. They will improve human life. And yes, there will be dislocation. One can't be callous about that for individual lives. But again, individuals that are able to stay ahead of that dislocation, they will reap tremendous dividends, not just in higher incomes, but in much greater freedom and leisure in their lives.
Yeah, I take your point. It's how to improve lives and livelihoods as well. And, if we can use the tech to try and solve big world problems like hunger, world hunger and poverty and, distribution of wealth, etc. What amazing technology to have. The one fear potentially as well, which is not necessarily linked to jobs. And I experienced this firsthand when I went back to South Africa recently to visit, when a couple of pylons that weren't maintained fell over in the strong winds of Port Elizabeth, where I'm from. And the whole city was, or not the whole, but a lot of the city was out of electricity for 5 days while they tried to erect this again. And as a result, there was also a lot of homes without water as well, because there was no electricity going to the pumps to pump the water from the reservoirs. And what occurred to me was that just without AI and robotics and the other technology, advanced technology we're talking about, there was a heavy reliance on basic technology, getting water to your tap, putting a light bulb on, being able to cook, all the stuff that people had in their freezers going off. And what do I do with this? I can't cook it. I can't keep it frozen. It's a waste of food. I can't bath. I can't shower. So one of the fears potentially there is if we rely too much on the technology, if it's not available, what happens then to us?
Yes. Well, look, it's a classic problem, right? So I had a professor at Oxford, economic historian, Professor Abner Offer, fascinating guy. And one of his very interesting quotes is that the luxuries of one generation become the necessities of another. So Wi-Fi to my parents was a luxury. They experienced it like in their late adult life. I was, 15 by the time, or maybe even older by the time Wi-Fi, like we had Wi-Fi in our home. For me, it's an absolute abject necessity. There's like unthinkable that I could be without Wi-Fi for any minute of the day. And that's true for any sort of technology. Like rail was a luxury for people in mid 19th century. By 1900, it was an abject necessity for people living in London, for example. TVs, vacuum cleaners, dishwashers. We could sort of talk about that with anything. So I think in that sense, the a little bit of the temperature around AI is a little Luddite. It's like any other technology. It's a luxury right now. Not everyone can afford it. It's clunky. It doesn't always work. Lots of problems. And the other, all of them accept it. It's going to be a necessity by next generation. And there's going to be no escape. So just get on board and enjoy it. And it's again, don't be callous about its obvious risks. Like any technology has risks, but it's also this scalability journey that has an inevitability to it. And in that sense, it's a fun ride.
What do we lose out when we live in this AI world of the present or the future?
Look, that's the human essence piece, right? So like we are, and I think this is the World Economic Forum's work, which is even before the advent of LLMs, is that we are moving into this whole new area in which we're probably, my generation, I'm 45 years old now, is the last generation that's entirely analog in our biophysical form. So I'm over time, the next generation or so, we may have a human digital fusion where our devices, and I'm wearing at least half a dozen on me right now, will actually be embedded inside human body rather than wearable devices. And, and these are sort of elements of science fiction, but it could lead to gene editing. It could certainly lead to gene lifting. All of that there's a very viable, plausible future in which that's coming. And with things like Neuralink, etc., it's inevitable that there will be chip-brain coherence at some point. And so, we are talking about future hybrid forms of, silicon-based and DNA-based intelligences in interacting without using eyes and hands, like just much greater fusion at the neurological level. I mean, it sounds science fiction-y, but again, this is very early in human history. These things will come to pass. When, who knows?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, everything I've seen to date, there was something just in the news this week around they had digitized or mapped an entire brain of a fruit fly. I'm sure if you saw this, Atif, and how much of this is real. And they'd put it in a digital environment and it had acted and behaved and fed and walked around as if it had a physical body. And it's the first of its kind to be completely digitized, which blows my mind. As you said, it's very science fiction, very Black Mirror, but it's inevitable. And I think Jeff Bezos said something really interesting I think it might have been the World Economic Forum, where he said, our generation, I think we're all in the part of the same generation, because we're the last of the analogs, right? We grew up without the internet, we grew up without tablets and Wi-Fi and all of that stuff. And you become very appreciative of where you're at. But for the kids that I've got 2 kids, they've not lived in a world that didn't have Wi-Fi, tablets, AI. For them, innately, it's if they get upset if it's 5 minutes of Wi-Fi down. And I recognized this when I was living in London, Dale. This is a perfect example where I got really used to, I was there for about 3 years, but I got really used to getting a train every 2 minutes. And I remember standing at the train once at Greenwich, and a train had just been past. We just missed the train. And this guy next to me would just blew up. He's like, "Oh, bloody hell!" He was fuming and swearing and carrying on because he had to wait 2 minutes for a train. I come back to Australia and I'm waiting 16 minutes for a train to the major city, and I live 10 minutes away from the city. So there definitely is this proximity around patience. And because we are the last generation, Jeff Bezos said something around, we won't be the generation remembered for bringing in AI, but we will be the generation remembered for building the infrastructure. And I thought that was a very pleasant way of saying what we will actually leave as our legacy. And it'll be our generation that do that, is building this awesome thing called AI and all the compute power and the energy required to build it. And I thought it was a fascinating way to look at it prospectively. One question I have is this data center arms race that obviously we hear a lot of the news, and I don't know how much this is just hyperbole and polarizing, but there is certainly a race, I think, to build and have the biggest compute power, particularly between China and the US and various other countries in the world. What's your take on that, Atif? Do we need to be doing the same down in the south? Can I let the Australian government know, hey, we should be also pushing forward? Is it whoever has the most data centers wins? What's the strategy there, putting your economic hat on?
Look, so fascinating areas. In any technological boom, there's a lot of wasteful investment, but that's, again, an inevitable corollary. So like in the railway boom of the 1850s, and again, I'm citing Avnof's work here, we ended up with way more rail lines than the country needed, but it's almost like an inevitable dynamic of figuring out and overshooting the demand before the demand corrects the supply curve and things like that, and touched on the obsolescence curve and all of that. So I think these are just simple, inevitable market dynamics, and I don't think there's any way of engineering it any better. It's just simply how capitalism works and the creative destruction. So we will create this infrastructure. Some of it will be completely superfluous to need, and it will get destroyed, and some people will waste money, and that's fine. It's just how it works. Give you an example, by the way. Back in the 50s, IBM built about 29 data centers, which rival in size and scale to today's hyperscale data centers, in collaboration with MIT for a Department of Defense program called SAGE. And this was a multi-billion dollar, 1950s money, a multi-billion dollar data center program back then, all with like vacuum tubes, etc. And when they tried to make the system work in early 60s, it didn't work. So they put all this money in. But the creative destruction aspect of that is that Tom Watson, the CEO of IBM then, basically locked up his whole team in a warehouse in upstate New York and said, look, we're never building such a white elephant again, and you've got to go and design a better computer, and you're not coming out of this warehouse until you're done. And they were all locked in for 5 years, and after that they came out with IBM 360, which became the ancestor of almost every known computer to date. So this creative destruction process is almost essential to leaps of innovation that we go through. So I think in that sense, should government of Australia be investing heavily? Probably not. Should it be making it easy for private sector developers to invest? 100% yes. Should it make it easy to get electricity permits, water permits? Just get out of the way to, not be severely in the way. I'm being a bit facetious, but I'm exhibiting my free market bias here. That But inevitably, the government itself, particularly through its own needs, and is a customer of data centers, and in that sense, it should continue buying these services according to its needs. So I'm not saying it should do anything more or less, but by and large, I think where it becomes problematic is when it either crowds out private capital or over-regulates and becomes a bit too involved in governing decisions of private capital.
Yeah, and you touched on something that was interesting to me, because we saw the invention of mobile phones and other things that they started really big. I remember my granddad, he was a real estate agent, and he had one of the first phones in his car, and it was this big old brick. He was an Indian guy, and he had this big old brick, and he thought it was very, very handy, but it was absolutely useless. But if they didn't progress that, and you saw the rise and fall of phones, but the evolution is that they got smaller and smarter. And we saw the same thing with even energy and nuclear power plants getting smaller and smaller as they got more mature, and that learning curve, then the supply versus the demand, also then forced innovation to make things less cost at the onset. In the design of data centers, will we see smaller, more distributed data centers? I also point out that Meta was trying different ways of housing data centers by using tents. I think they had the first tent data centers. I saw some of them popped up just to save on infrastructure build, and the speed in which they could get these data centers up was incredible. But obviously tents are not for permanent residency. Are we seeing the same thing with data centers? Will there be a trend towards smaller, more efficient micro data centers just to keep them integrated in network and not a target for, say, terrorism or other things, the security risks? But are you seeing that they eventually will get smaller and smaller, like the GPU itself is getting smaller and smaller?
So look, like I said earlier, I think it's like a neuron system, right? So you need neurons all across your body. And there'll be all kinds of data centers, big, small, micro, macro, and frankly, many more. There's a great book called Superintelligence by a colleague of mine at Oxford, Nick Bostrom, really worth reading. And it's sort of like a philosophical argument, but almost like the thinking is like an economist underpinning that. Basic idea is a superintelligence needs a lot of compute and a lot of power. It's insatiable. And in that sense, he calls it the cosmic endowment. So superintelligence will essentially try and consume all the resources it could possibly lay its hands on in the cosmos that it could get to. So the Earth is a very, very small place. So the number of data centers we need extend to the cosmic ring with centering on Earth, not just Earth. And the number of data centers we need to build over the next 1,000 years as human race is approximates infinity, and all the nuclear power and everything else that needs to go around across with it. So in that sense, this construction boom is just the chain reaction has just begun. We've seen nothing.
This is where we do get into the science fiction, Atif, because you think about the amount of energy that's consumed, and I can't recall the scientist's name. He talked about the types of civilization, so type 2 civilization harnesses the whole power of the sun, and they talk about a Dyson sphere. And basically, from the type of energy that's going to be consumed, we consume all the energy available on the Earth. Then there's no other way but to go to space and consume all the energy of our local sun and then beyond. Have you heard anything of that nature or read any books in that space yet, Atif?
Well, superintelligence is probably my source, and it's the same idea. So basically, that superintelligence, in order to become more and more intelligent, it's just got to lay its hands on as much energy and as many resources as it possibly can. And in that sense, again, it's just a simple law of scalability. But, these things are not that as far away as sometimes people imagine them to be. Obviously, all of this is predicated that we don't kill ourselves as a race, before we get to that point. So there's some serious there's serious constraints to this, because all of this may just end very abruptly, because of stupid decisions that are outside all of our controls. Having said that, going back to the earlier conversations, like if we are the last of the analogs, there's certain elements of the human essence that carry on. So like keep reading literature, read poetry, paint, like you said, you're an artist, Val. So do creative analog things, because there's a huge amount of the human essence that also will carry on alongside the superintelligence revolution. And, soon enough, and that, by the way, that's a little bit, there's few years to go, we're still the highest form of intelligence that we can observe. So we still have an advantage. So we can certainly shape some of this right now, but eventually, this will exceed our kind of DNA-bound levels of intelligence as a race.
Yeah, 100%. I think for anyone listening as well, or yourself, Atif, The Last of the Analog sounds like a perfect movie title or book title. I would love to see that out on shelves. I think that'd be very, very interesting to hear. Dale, anything else from you, mate?
No, I was just thinking there, if we're talking sci-fi, which group or nation will be the Mandalorians of the future? But I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, Atif.
Me too. I have one question for you guys. What are you bringing this back to Earth, right? So, based on all the conversations you have, what are project professionals really using in advanced technology tools? Let's not even call it AI. That you think is really causing excitement right now for people in the industry.
Go first, Phil. We'll get the Aussie view.
He's such a gentleman. Well, I think it's the transition of power. So the distribution of power is controlled by platforms as a service and software as a service. The subscription model for all projects to date, right, has been the Oracles of the world, the Microsofts, but I am seeing a trend towards smaller use of consultants and the ability to build their own products that aren't vertical products. What I mean by that is the ability to say, I want a tool that does 80% of this software company, but I also want it to do X, Y, and Z. And I'm seeing a lot more, let's call it courage to build their own platforms. And what that's done is interesting. Like, it's changed the subscription model in Australia, at least, where now they're not going to, let's say, Oracle Primavera for their planning and scheduling services. They're not going to third-party systems to build integrations. They're actually looking internally. No more are the SAP. Now, there's a big gap between vibe coding an application and using an enterprise software. There's a big risk there for sure. But I would say in the next couple of years, a lot of clients, particularly client side, are building their own ideas of what they want as a project delivery mechanism a complete ecosystem internally as opposed to building something outside. The value of that should be that AI is embedded in everything that we do from a project management perspective, but also the visibility, transparency of that project means that people can make informed decisions faster, which is always a challenge, if you ask me and Dale, because every time we go do, and anyone who's in the project space knows we do 4-week reporting. So you do your end of month, you write narratives, you put some KPIs together. 90% of those will be lagging indicators, i.e. it's good to know, but so what? You can't really do anything because it's already happened. So I'm seeing a lot more trend now in leading indicators and starting to think about how we can utilize software to give us immediate real-time analysis as opposed to lagging inference from some project manager who's just trying to protect his job, which I thought's really exciting for me. So I'm really loving that space. I don't know about you, Dale.
Yeah, no, so everything you said is similar to what I'm seeing. The two things I will add is that I think specifically in the UK, it's quite difficult to get away from Primavera because a lot of the time it's stipulated in the contract to be used. So what I'm seeing is that particularly project controls professionals are using data from the likes of P6 and other tools that they ordinarily use, which is predominantly Excel for a lot of the other things, but then putting that into tools and systems to analyze it far quicker and get insights out of it that perhaps is not very apparent to the human eye. The other thing that I've seen pick up quite a lot is site to office communication. So the ability to take a photo with the geolocation and timestamped and automatically flag that to the office, linked to the P6 activity. If it's poor ground conditions, raising that early warning via an NEC contractual mechanism and whichever tool that is being used, etc. And so all of a sudden we have this record, but we also have this communication channel that is far faster than someone recording it, perhaps taking a picture and then going back to office and typing an email and then trying to log it and then looking for the specific clause that they need and then doing the form and then setting up the meeting to discuss it. So I see technology speeding that bit up, and there's a lot of commercial tension on projects, as we know. So we can remove that commercial tension, it speeds projects up, which is an artificial tension, if you ask me, because that's human-made.
Phenomenal.
And the hour's gone by far too quickly. I knew it would from the start. But look, before we let you go, do you have any final thoughts for our listeners?
Keep learning, and the world's your oyster.
Very, very wise words there. Val, any final thoughts from you?
No, that was action-packed. Lots of information for people to digest and dilute into. But, anyone with a liberal arts degree, you're in luck because that's going to be very, very useful in the future, it sounds like.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. Thank you, gents. Very pleasure to meet you.
The pleasure and privilege is all ours, Atif. So there you have it, folks. That is the end of this episode. But remember, if you like what you've heard, please do help us pay it forward and share a link to this episode on your favorite social media. Once again, a massive thank you to Dr. Atif Ansar. And thank you all for listening. Till next time, we say stay safe, be disruptive, and have fun doing it. From me and Val, it's bye for now.